I'm pleased here today to introduce the Animal Health and Welfare Amendment and Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2021, which is draft legislation to prohibit fur farming in Ireland, to the House. The final version of the bill, drafted by the Office of the Attorney-General, was approved by Government at its meeting on the 19th of October 2021. The Government also authorised the Minister to introduce the bill into the Dáil or Seanad for debate. The general scheme of the bill was previously approved by Government and has been through pre-legislative scrutiny in the Joint Committee on Agriculture, Food and the Marine. The programme for Government 2020 includes a commitment to bring forward legislation that prohibits fur farming in the state. While fur farming was once legal and socially acceptable in most countries, there is now a broad consensus among veterinary and other scientific experts that certain animals should not be farmed for their fur or skin because of serious animal welfare concerns that cannot be mitigated. There are also increasing societal concerns in this regard. There are 3 active farms in the state that breed and rear mink for the purposes of pelting for the fur industry. The statutory prohibition on fur farming will, in particular, impact these 3 farms who are currently operating a lawful business. For this reason, the draft legislation makes provision for a scheme of compensation that my department will make available to the 3 farm businesses affected by the prohibition. The bill also introduces other miscellaneous amendments to the Animal Health and Welfare Act of 2013. The provisions of the bill that govern the nature of the compensation scheme that can be provided for ensure that mink farming operators are to be compensated for losses and costs directly resulting from the prohibition on fur farming in Ireland. The bill sets out criteria upon which compensation for income loss, non-income loss and certain costs will be payable. The types of costs that will be covered by any compensation scheme made under the legislation will include redundancy payments to employees, certain professional fees, mink disposal and clean-up costs and the costs involved in the demolition of mink buildings. It should be noted, Lasconcorda, that the specific details regarding the methodology for calculating the compensation payable in respect of income and non-income losses and costs incurred are to be provided for in regulations made by the Minister rather than being set in the primary legislation. Provisions have also been inserted into the bill that will allow the Minister to authorise advance compensation payments to affected farmers in respect of any particular income loss, non-income loss or type of cost which can subsequently be offset against any compensation amount to be made. The bill provides for the appointment of an assessor whose function shall be to examine an application for compensation submitted and to determine the amount of compensation payable. The bill provides that an assessor may require information or documents from an applicant, and applicants are obligated to assist and cooperate with the assessor in this respect. The bill makes provision for appeal to the High Court. In addition, the bill provides that the decision of an assessor can be appealed by both the Minister. The bill provides procedures for the payment of compensation and includes express provision authorising the Minister to offset any advance payments that may have previously been made. The bill makes it an offence to engage in fur farming and provides for appropriate penalties. It also provides for a procedure for the disposal of fur-producing animals lawfully seized following commencement of the prohibition on fur farming. The legislation also includes some technical amendments to the Animal Health and Welfare Act of 2013 and a repeal of the Milk Miscellaneous Provisions Act 1979, which is no longer required and is not being replaced. I now wish Lasconcorda to deal with some of the main provisions of the bill. In Section 1, it outlines the definition section for the purposes of this Act, and it contains one definition only, which is the Animal Health and Welfare Act as defined as the Act of 2013. In Section 2, we have an amendment to the definition of an animal product set out in Section 2 of the 2013 Act. The new definition of animal product will include wool, skin, fur or feathers derived from an animal. Section 3 is an amendment of Section 39 of the Act of 2013. Section 39 provides Gardaí with the power of arrest without warrant for certain animal health and welfare offences. This amendment will confer a power on Gardaí to arrest without warrant a person who breaches the prohibition on fur farming provided for later in this bill. Section 4 is an amendment of Section 52 of the Act of 2013. It provides for penalties that apply to animal health and welfare offences. This amendment asserts the penalties that will apply to a person convicted of breaching the prohibition on fur farming provided for in this bill. The offence will be prosecuted in an indictment only indicating the serious nature of the offence. and the person convicted will be liable to a fine not exceeding €250,000 and or a term of imprisonment not exceeding 5 years. Section 5 is a repeal of Part 12 of the Act of 2013. Part 12 of the Animal Health and Welfare Act 2013 contained provisions in relation to the regulation and licensing of animal marts. This part of the 2013 Act has never been commenced. The Minister's sole policy concern in relation to marts relates to animal health and animal welfare, and not the business of an animal mart as currently provided for in Part 12. Section 6 inserts a new Part 12A into the 2013 Act containing 13 separate sections that collectively provide for matters such as the prohibition on fur and skin farming, compensation for existing fur farmers and related ancillary matters. These new provisions are numbered 71A to 71M, and I'll deal with these provisions now separately, Last Concorda. So 71A provides for a set of definitions to apply to specific terms appearing in this new Part 12A. Of particular importance here is a wide definition given to a specified animal, which ensures that the prohibition on fur and skin farming contained in this new part is extensive. It should be noted, however, that the definition of fur or skin farming is confined to the breeding, rearing or keeping of specified animals solely or primarily for the value of their fur or skin. This prohibition will therefore not apply to animals farmed primarily for other purposes. Section 71B contains the prohibition on fur and skin farming and creates a new criminal offence of engaging in fur or skin farming, contravention of the section. 71C provides for a procedure to be followed for the disposal of specified animals that have been seized by authorised officers on the basis that they are being kept for the value of their fur or skin and contravention of the prohibition. The Minister shall, as soon as practicable after the seizure and detention, apply a district court or to a district court for an order authorising the disposal. A notice is required to be served on the person before an application to the court is made. Section 71D sets out the overarching principles that will govern the compensation payable to existing fur farming enterprises that will be forced to cease their businesses as a direct consequence of the prohibition. Losses and costs incurred as a direct result. The amount of compensation for each affected fur farming business is to be determined by an independent assessor to be appointed by the Minister. The bill contains principles and policies that authorise the Minister to make regulations to specify the income and non-income losses and other costs in respect of which compensation will be payable, also the basis of valuation for assessing income and non-income losses, and to provide for financial limits to apply to certain compensation payments where appropriate. Regulations will also provide compensation for the costs involved in disposing of breeding mink, demolition and clean-up costs, for payments required to be made to redundant workers, for certain professional fees incurred in the preparation of applicants' claim form and in the making of representations to my department relating to the development of this legislation. Finally, regulations can also be made to provide for a number of administrative matters, including advance payments to claimants prior to any final determination of their compensation entitlements under the bill, the appointment of an assessor, the form and content of applications for compensation, information required to be furnished by applicants, and any other matters that are incidental, supplemental and consequential thereto. Section 71E provides for the appointment of an assessor to determine the amount of compensation that will be payable to an applicant. The person so appointed must possess an appropriate level of skill, knowledge and qualifications to perform this important function. The assessor shall be independent and shall be paid fees and expenses determined by the Minister and the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform. Section 71C establishes the procedure to be followed when an application for compensation is received by the Minister. The provision requires the Minister to appoint an assessor and to transmit the application and any documents required to him or her. Thereafter, the assessor examines such information or documentation received and goes on to make his or her determination. Section 71G provides the assessor with the power to require further information or documentation from an applicant if the assessor considers that it is reasonably necessary to have that additional information. The assessor may issue a notice in writing requiring applicants to provide further information or documents or to verify such information or documents within a defined period for response. Where the information or document is in the power, possession or procurement of a third party, the applicant shall make every reasonable effort to obtain that information. Section 71H provides a direction to an assessor, or provides a direction to an assessor rather, on how to proceed in the event of a failure of an applicant to cooperate. Essentially, this section provides that where there is a failure to provide documentation, information or assistance to an assessor, the bill will allow him or her to determine the application in a manner that has regard to the fact the information or documentation submitted or requested was incomplete, or that assistance required was not forthcoming. In such circumstances, an assessor may draw any adverse inferences that he or she considers appropriate, including, albeit only in the most extreme of circumstances, making a determination that the applicant is not entitled to compensation. Section 71I provides for the procedure that the assessor will be required to follow when determining a compensation application under the bill. Essentially, when the assessor has determined the amount of compensation payable under this bill, he or she will be required to notify the applicant in writing of the determination reached in relation to each income loss, each non-income loss, and the type of cost applied for and the reasons for the determination. And a copy of the notice of determination shall also be given to the Minister. Section 71J provides for an appeal option where either the Minister or an applicant is dissatisfied with the assessor's compensation determination. Appeals against the assessor's determination will be brought in the High Court, and applicants will have 3 months to lodge any such appeal. The High Court will have the power to affirm, vary or set aside an assessor's determination. In addition, the High Court may, where appropriate, substitute its own determination for that of assessors. The High Court will also have the power to remit an assessor's determination back to the Minister should it consider it appropriate to do so. In the circumstances, this legislation will provide an effective right of appeal against an assessor's compensation determination should any party to it consider it necessary to challenge same. Section 71K is related to the High Court appeal option and directs that where a compensation determination has been remitted by the High Court, that the Minister shall assign an assessor to consider the matter as appropriate, having regard to the Court's judgment and order. Section 71L requires payment of compensation. The Minister shall pay the assessor's determination as soon as practicable. Where an appeal has been made, the Minister shall pay after the date on which the determination under appeal cases ceases to be under appeal. If the High Court has made an order, the Minister shall pay the compensation in accordance with the order as soon as practicable. Section 71M regards the revocation of licences. The Act provides for the revoking of all licences to farm mink for the value of their fur that are current on the day before the commencement of Part 12A of the Bill. This is the final provision of the new Part 12A, which will be inserted into the existing Animal Health and Welfare Act 2013, and which will govern the prohibition on fur and skin farming and related matters. Section 7 is an amendment last concorded to Schedule 3 to Act 2013, which the Department seeks to licence marts by way of secondary legislation for the purposes of ensuring health and welfare of animals present in the mart. To this end, a new mart-specific paragraph 48 or 40A is inserted into Schedule 3 of the 2013 Act, and a minor consequential amendment is made to existing paragraph 40. Then Section 8 is a repeal of certain legislation. The bill provides for the repeal of the Miscellaneous Provisions Act 1979, as this Act is no longer required and it won't be replaced. Section 9 is the short title, Collective Citation, Construction and Commencement. The section cites this Act as the Animal Health and Welfare Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2021, provides the Animal Health and Welfare Acts 2013 and 2019, and this Act shall be construed as one Act as Animal Health and Welfare Acts 2013 to 2021. It also contains a commencement provision which will authorise me to choose the date on which the provisions of this legislation will come into operation. In conclusion, last concordata, I have presented a detailed view of the provisions of the bill. The legislation will prohibit fur farming in Ireland. There is now a broad consensus among veterinary and other scientific experts that certain animals should not be furred for their fur or skin because of serious animal welfare concerns that cannot be mitigated. There are also increasing concerns and societal concerns in this regard, as you know, last concordata, and the legislation makes provision for a fair and reasonable scheme of compensation that my department will make available to the 3 farm businesses affected by the prohibition who are currently operating legitimate businesses, and to all of the necessary standards, and for whom this move is a very significant one indeed. I commend the bill to the Dáil.
Some unusual pagination here. 1375, just a page. We move on to the Sinn Féin Deputy Matt Carthy. Is it 5? Am I 5 minutes? 5 minutes.
Yeah, talk. Okay. No, me jogam. Last concordata, agus gormaiget. So just to put on the record that Sinn Féin support a prohibition on for farming, and as such we will be supporting this bill, and I commend the Minister for bringing this bill to the House in a timely manner. And I do think it's important to note that while many of us probably will have little interest or little understanding of fur farming, and it would be an alien concept to many, it is important to put on the record that those who have been engaged in it have been doing so legally and to standards that have been set out, and through the deliberations at the Oireachtas Agriculture Committee and other engagements that we've been had, there has been no suggestion that those who have been operating have been doing so to anything other than the absolute standards that have been set out. There have been quite clearly animal welfare concerns and societal concerns, as has been raised, and I do think it's appropriate that in 2021 that we act on those. I do think there will be scope, and I hope the Minister will be open to further deliberations in relation to the proposal of amendments. I have some questions in relation to the huge flexibility that is now in place with regard to the compensation package. You will know that during pre-legislative scrutiny there were very different sets of figures set out by the Department and by the industry in relation to the actual costs that may be involved. I note in this legislation now that some of the points of contention aren't defined in the actual legislation, and therefore I think it is important that we ensure that that we don't end up in a situation of serious dispute, particularly as this legislation provides recourse to the High Court. And I think it would be an absolute travesty if we ended up in a situation where huge sums of money were spent in legal wrangling as opposed to actually addressing this issue. There's also a very important issue that needs to be addressed with regard to the workers. This is a very unique situation. There are people who are working on farms, earning a wage as PAYE workers, and they're going to lose their jobs because of an act decided by this Oireachtas. And I think it's entirely unfair in that circumstances that they would just be expected or entitled to statutory redundancy. And I hope that some of the government ministers will be able to outline how that matter can be addressed going forward. There were particular issues that were raised at pre-legislative scrutiny, and particularly with regard to the removal and disposal of asbestos at some of the sites. I don't know if the Minister can indicate today whether those issues have been addressed. And there's also been issues with regard to the engagements with local authorities with regard to any planning issues that might arise from the change of use or the dismantling of these farms. And again, I think it would be useful if we could get clarification as to whether or not the Department has carried out assessments of all of that. There's a number of areas with regard to animal welfare concerns that need to be addressed by this House. But in conclusion, I welcome and commend the fact that we have made progress on this issue. I look forward to, and I hope that the Minister will work with us constructively as we move through the remaining stages of this bill. The bill does allow, as is usually the case, for the Minister to set in date the time frame for when this will actually be enacted, and I would welcome a commitment that it is his intention that when we proceed through the Houses of the Oireachtas, which I hope we can do so speedily, that he will also then act speedily in terms of enacting it, and that we can clearly show that this House has been decisive in moving forward on this issue.
Deputy Patricia Ryan.
Minister, the programme for government includes a commitment to bring forward legislation that prohibits fur farming in the state. This bill is a welcome development. While fur farming was once legal and socially acceptable in most countries, there is now a broad consensus that certain animals should not be farmed for their fur because of serious animal welfare concerns that cannot be addressed. There are just 3 active farms in the state that breed and rear mink for the purposes of pelting for the fur industry. The tide is turning against fur farming. It is already banned in Austria, Croatia, the Netherlands, Britain and the Czech Republic. It will be illegal in Norway from February 2025. We must ensure that this legislation is dealt with swiftly. In December each year, about 80% of mink are killed, leaving about 20% as breeding stock. This will leave about 24,000 mink in the country in the new year. Currently, there are 120,000. We must ensure that this year is the last breeding season. There are alternatives to fur for those that want them. There is a new material to the market, Cobra fur, which is a bio-based fur made not from petroleum oil, but from oil from the vegetable crops. There is a recycled fur, making use of what already have, and reducing landfill and pollution is critical to an environmentally friendly future. The main purpose of this bill is the statutory prohibition of fur farming and will impact 3 farms in the state, including one in County Laois, who are currently operating a lawful business. For this reason, the legislation makes provision for a scheme of compensation to be made available to these. These provisions of the bill that govern the nature of the compensation scheme that can be provided to ensure that mink farming operators are to be compensated for losses and costs directly resulting from the prohibition on fur farming in Ireland. The bill sets out criteria upon which compensation for income loss, non-income loss and certain costs will be payable. What I would like to see is a retaining fund put in place for the 30 to 40 workers between the 3 farms. There must be a just transition for them. Mink are an invasive species and it can only help our biodiversity to have all mink removed from the country. Perhaps the former workers could assist in helping to remove escaped wild mink which are wreaking havoc on local ecology before being retrained. I, for one, will be glad to see an end to this activity and we need to take action for the animals' sake. Garth Maga.
Martin Browne.
And I also commend you for bringing this bill to the House. I'm sure that many people watching on here today will not be sorry to see the end of fur farming in the state. It's a practice that has faced opposition for many years now, and finally the days of fur farming and the slaughter of these animals is coming to an end, especially for their skin. The existence of these types of farms has not settled well with me, so I will not mourn the loss of fur farms to the state. Indeed, as a party, Sinn Féin has been opposed to the farming of mink since the 2007 Ardesh, so therefore we as a party and I will be supporting this bill. But like any enterprise, fur farms are business that employ people, and that's what we have to remember here and have been invested in. And this is what we must take note of when analysing this bill, because we're talking about a piece of legislation that will introduce a prohibition of this type of business, and in this case fur farming. But it is a business nonetheless. Jobs will be lost and livelihoods will be affected and families will be affected. So like any other sector, we have to examine how the issues of compensation and recompense will be organised for workers. Can the department detail any progress that has been made in relation to the issue of the statutory redundancy, and do they foresee anything above statutory redundancy being provided? And where are we in relation to the request that a retraining fund for staff be put in place? Given the change they will experience in their work life as a result of this, it's only right that such retraining, as has been said already, that it be provided for them. When this matter was discussed at the Agriculture Committee, I inquired about the cost that would be involved in removing asbestos roofs, which we were told will have to be dealt with. Can the ERA give us any indication has that been addressed? Because as I recall, during their appearance at the committee, they claimed that 2 out of 3 farms had asbestos in their buildings. And at the time of the committee's discussion, we were told that the department was looking at a cap of €50 per square metre. And I did say at that time, I worked for 35 years in that business, and to talk about €50 to get rid of asbestos is in dreamland, and it won't cover the costs. So someone, whether it is the department or the industry itself, is being asked to take the cost. Also, can the department confirm whether or not they are sticking to that figure, and if the additional costs would be involved in the asbestos removal, because there's the transportation and the disposal which can take place in this country to be taken into account. And in relation to the same issue, has the department engaged with the relevant local authorities regarding an assessment of the possible environmental impact that the demolition of the structures concerned may have? This hadn't been the case at the time the matter was discussed at the committee. If this is being done, what was the outcome of these talks? The committee also witnessed a divergence of opinion between the department and the fur farmers over how the compensation scheme would be designed and whether or not it would factor in a dip in the market the stakeholders claimed had been experienced between 2015 and 2020. Do we have an update on that? And now, before I end, I want to ask about the future when it comes to this industry overall. Given that we're banning the fur industry here in Ireland, is there any intention or have any plans been made to tackle the industry in general? By this I mean dealing with the importation of fur of this nature. Does the department intend to ban fur for importation as well, or does our opposition to the practice end with the banning of the industry here? To conclude, I support this bill and welcome the fact that fur farming in this country is being prohibited. I also note that it makes provision to also ban fur farming that does not currently occur in Ireland involving other animals and for significant penalties for those who do. But of course, the workers affected will need to be assisted through this change, and it is important that the department treats them fairly and appropriately.
Deputy Cronin.
I too welcome this bill, Minister, and Sinn Féin will be supporting it. I think it's fair to say there is a widespread and growing unease at the use of animal furs in clothing, and the reduction of an animal to a pelt, a fashion accessory, are a symbol of wealth and status. Growing up, I remember the protests on fur on the catwalks and the banners that said it takes 50 dumb animals to make this coat, but only one to wear it. Stark but effective. As a society, we no longer have to rely on animal skins for warmth or protection. Fur is a luxury we can no longer afford in terms of public health and animal welfare. Worldwide, there are concerns about the intensive conditions of animals farmed for fur and a growing sense that is no longer acceptable. It's not just a case of less is more and fewer are better, but none at all is ideal. And while this compassion for animals and worry for their welfare is admirable and desirable, it has a major impact on the people who have made fur farming their lives, many of them through generations. It's of critical importance to our own fur farmers who have been farming well and legally and to high standards. In some cases, generations of families were reared on the strength of it. They know their business backwards and have invested heavily in their operations in terms of commitment, skill and money, and they cannot now be abandoned. They must be compensated and fairly for the dramatic changes in their professional fortunes on which whole families depend for a living. For Sinn Féin, our fur farmers are no different to any other workers who merit respect and dignity, particularly at a time of major change and readjustment. These are well-run businesses, real livelihoods, with careers and futures on the line, so the packages must be right. And I commend Deputy Ryan as well on what she suggested, because there were a lot of wild mink that have been left into the wild by misled activists, and I think it would be a very good idea to perhaps look at what she suggested. There's also the psychological and emotional aspects of change that are required, factors that cannot be underestimated and must be addressed in the same way as the practical. It cannot be the case that the state would abandon these small operators at the very time they most need our help. Sinn Féin is not alone in having concerns about this compensation and how it is devised. There seems to be a lack of it, and it's not the package that it could be. Deputy McCarthy and Deputy Browne have already mentioned the asbestos, and I really think you have to look at that again, Minister, please. These are major practical concerns that are a source of worry to the operators and their workers. We are also duly concerned about the statutory redundancy and the retraining fund that the operators have sought. It is a necessary lifeline to those who will be seeking employment in other areas after years of specialising in farming animals for fur. There are also the environmental aspects to be considered. I believe there needs to be more done and better, with a focus on the issues overall: financial, practical and psychological. So I wish to make it clear that in Sinn Féin we are anxious that these hard-working people not be abandoned but be supported throughout the necessary changes. There is a lot more to do for these workers and businesses so people can feel protected and can face the future with a modicum of confidence and dignity. Ivana
And I'm glad to speak today for Labour in support of this bill and in support of the key principle and purpose of this bill, namely to introduce a statutory prohibition on fur farming. Speaking for Labour and speaking myself as a long-standing advocate for animal rights, I'm really glad to see this legislation come before us, Minister, and I think it's receiving a very broad welcome, which is really good to see. And there is indeed a growing acceptance of the need for such a prohibition, as others have said. I think we're all conscious also, though, of the need to ensure a just transition, of the fact that there are jobs that will be affected by this, and for that reason I'm glad also to see the scheme of compensation that's provided for in such detail in the legislation, and that's very welcome. I'm conscious that although this is directly an animal welfare and animal health bill, and very welcome in that regard, that we're debating it as it happens just as the government's climate action plan is being published. And I do want to thank Minister Ryan and his officials for putting in place earlier today a really useful brief and valuable briefing with opposition spokespersons, including myself, on climate, at which we discussed and heard from the Minister directly what is in the climate action plan. And I think the reason why I mention it in the context of this bill is because the climate action plan provides a very welcome requirement for policy coherence, for joined up thinking across all departments on measures to tackle the climate crisis and the climate emergency. And a key part of that is ensuring a greater biodiversity, ensuring that we have robust and effective legislation on animal rights, on animal welfare, and on protection of our wildlife, of our natural and wonderful biodiversity. And even though I'm a TD for an urban area in Dublin Bay South, we have immense biodiversity and a huge amount of really great, natural amenities in my own local community in Portobello, where I live along the canal, where we have a huge amount of wildlife, where we have really good service being offered by the Council and by Waterways Ireland in many ways to ensure that wildlife is protected, the swans on the canal and so on. Also in Dublin Bay, although I do think we can do a lot more to ensure better quality of water and therefore protection of the marine life in our waters. And I'm working with your colleagues in government on that as well, along with NGOs like SOS Dublin Bay. So I think that for me, this bill is part of an overall package of measures that we do need to see adopted across all of government, and with constructive support from us in opposition too, to ensure that there are huge benefits to our communities from promotion of biodiversity, from promotion of a joined-up policy like that enumerated in the Climate Action Plan that will ensure better protection of animals, of wildlife, and more sustainable cities and communities in line with our SDG 11, our Sustainable Development Goals, that we have such a commitment to. So, Minister, I'm not going to speak for long. I'm not the agriculture spokesperson, but I am very glad to speak in support of this bill and to reiterate my support and the support of the Labour Party for this important measure, which will see us finally move to a prohibition on fur farming in the interests of animal health and animal welfare and animal rights.
Next speaker is not here, so moving on. Sinn Féin, Thomas Gould.
Minister, as my colleague said, we'll be supporting this bill because it's long past time that mink farming was outlawed. It is a cruel and unnecessary practice, so we'll be supporting it. The bill, that is. I also want to raise another issue, a serious issue about animal welfare in Cork City. Just last week, a horse was found dead on a road in the city. Before the horse was found the day before, a number of people had contacted different organisations concerned about the treatment of this horse, about the neglect and abuse that it received. And it should have been rescued, but instead it was found on the road at the early hours of a morning. Now, this was an absolutely shocking way for a horse, a beautiful animal, to be treated this way. And we see people were really upset, and it's not fair for animals to be treated, any animal to be treated that way. And it's not fair for children and people to see this kind of behaviour by people, and it's not fair in communities that it happens in. I know from my colleagues that in areas like Clondalkin, they have a horse project that has been really successful in changing the way that animals are treated and bringing a reduction in the number of wild animals or animals that are being kept on greens and also reducing the neglect of them. But they also teach young people about animals and how to care for horses. And as a result of that, what you're seeing then is a lot of young people who mightn't be into formal education, it gives them an opportunity of a different type of education, which is something we need to look at. And what I'm looking for, Minister, is I would love to see one of these projects in Cork. I think it would make a huge difference for these animals, but also for young people, to give them the education and see what's involved. But this is not just for those children and those young people. This would give people in urban areas an opportunity to interact in close quarters with animals that they would normally never have an opportunity, or very rarely have an opportunity to do that. You could bring schools, youth organisations, community groups. You know, there are really loads of positive benefits to giving young people opportunities. So that's why I would love to see a project like this in Cork City. To be fair to Cork City Council, and I can be critical of it at times, a number of years ago they tried to do it, but unfortunately the planning was turned down. And that's something I think they should be supported on. And I hope you might engage with Cork City Council to see bringing forward a project like that, not just low in Cork, but nationally.
Thank you, Deputy. I'm not sure if it was relevant to the bill, but it was interesting.
Well, it gave me an opportunity, last Councillor.
Well, there are not many speakers competing, so we strained the relevance of it.
Slightly.
Okay, there's nobody else here, so Minister, it's back to yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much. Last Concord, I'd like to thank the various deputies for the many contributions, and indeed for the constructive support for the bill here this evening as well, or this afternoon. It's the first of a number of stages of bringing it through the Oireachtas, and I do look forward to constructive engagement at committee stage, and indeed to considering amendments and further assessment and interrogation of the various aspects of the bill to make sure that it is robust and that it's fully scrutinised as it goes through, rightly so, as it goes through the Oireachtas. I think it's really important to re-emphasise as well the fact that the three farmers that are in the state, that all three of them are complying with all of the regulation and always have done, have run very good operations according to the rules and requirements and the laws of the state, and to recognise that many of these farmers, this has been something that they've been doing for generations, and indeed they were very significantly encouraged to start out back in I think the 60s was when it first started off with support at that time, and as a new enterprise and as a new innovative industry of that time. But obviously life moves on and society moves on, and people's perceptions of what's acceptable and what is acceptable from a farming point of view and an animal welfare point of view changes. And in reflection of that, I think that's very much the situation. But that does have a real life impact for those three families concerned, and it is really important to point out that it's not a reflection on the business that they built up over the year, but it's a reflection of how society has overtaken the practice of farming animals for their fur or for their coats or pelts. So it's important that in relation to how we finalise and step this forward once the legislation is in place, that there is appropriate recognition of that from a financial point of view in terms of the impact on those three farmers, and the bill does provide for that in relation to its provisions. So overall, listen, I look forward to further engagement and thank the deputies for their contribution and for their support for the objective of the bill as well.
Minister, now that brings to a close the discussion on this bill, and the Isian Tarishkin now inish, Lefer and Billa and Dara Ur inish. The motion is that the bill be now read a second time. Is that agreed? Agreed, Garmagiv. So I understand it is proposed to refer this bill to the Select Committee on Agriculture, Food and the Marine pursuant to Standing Orders 95 and 181. And if the Minister could move the motion of referral now.
I so move.
Garmil Magiv. So Shin Jarrell Shin.